So welcome everybody to the second Whale Heritage Site Summit. First one was in the Azores 2 years ago. This is a kind of chance to make a pause on the scheme, on the process, and take a look at it and see what's working and what it isn't. The Whale Heritage Site initiative is just over a year old. So it's a great opportunity for us to sort of take a look at it. But also, as always, it's a fantastic when we come to a new location like this to showcase some of the applicants, candidate sites, and potential applicants. At this moment, we haven't had our first Whale Heritage Site accredited, but it's quite a long process to go through to get to Whale Heritage Site status, and it's coming. It's coming soon, I think. So what I wanted to do before the coffee break, we've got kind of three elements, okay? One of those elements is a little bit dry, because I want to talk you through a little bit of the background to the Whale Heritage Site initiative and also take you through some of the criteria. A little bit dry, but I think it's important that you start to get familiar with it for our uses over the next couple of days. Then we're going to squeeze in a little icebreaker. I know that most of you know each other, but I just like playing games, as Clive says. So we'll have some fun, and then I will welcome Peter Lynch to the stage before the coffee break to talk about Hervey Bay, which is currently a candidate Whale Heritage Site. And it's an absolute pleasure to have Peter here, and he's also been involved in so many of our discussions already. Amazing that he's come all the way from Australia to be part of this, so thank you, Peter. So without further ado then, let me introduce Whale Heritage Sites, if I can. So I want to show you two presentations. This one just gives you a kind of brief overview, and I think, the first thing to say is that part of the reason Whale Heritage Sites came into existence is because the WCA partnership believes that tourism can be a tremendously powerful mechanism for saving habitats and species. And in fact, we're seeing it. We are seeing that happen around the world for all the problems and all the issues. I was in a conference just over a year ago in which a monkey and ape specialist said to me, I think tourism is such a massive issue for the great apes and for other monkeys and macaques, which are increasingly involved. There are huge issues around disease transfer, for example, but I've come to the conclusion that it's pretty much the only thing that is going to save some of these species, particularly the big guys, the orangutans, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, but even some of these smaller species, because it provides local economic benefits for local communities, and it means that habitats get protected. And I think the same is very much true for cetaceans as we continue in the coming years. So we believe in that, but it's got to be done in the right way. So looking for the economic benefits, whale watching and dolphin watching can deliver sustainable livelihoods. And it's so important, as we've discussed over the last few days, that local communities are engaged in that whole process. And that has to be a positive thing. And we believe that's all about celebrating nature and celebrating these incredible animals. And of course, all that has to be backed up by the science, by the research. We can't talk about animals and celebrate animals if we don't understand them, if we don't know about them. And of course, that leads to further education and awareness. So I think that's sort of the background. Whale Heritage Sites, in a way, it's a sort of coming together of communities, we believe. It's two communities, one of which lives here on land, it's human beings, and the other one lives out there on the water, and that's cetaceans. And we know that cetaceans live in communities, have many common facets that we also share. And so Whale Heritage Sites is about that overlap where the land meets the sea, where we spend time on the water, and also celebrate these animals when we're back on land, and that potential for respectful coexistence between the animals. And I think that's the really sort of interesting thing about Whale Heritage Sites in many ways. It's this concept of these two highly intelligent groups of animals coming together in some way. Obviously, we're driving that process rather than the cetaceans, but we have so much in common. We are both right up there, at least by our own measures, as the most intelligent animals on this planet, humans, apes, and cetaceans. And we both have really strong social bonds. You know, that's why we're all here. That's why you were out drinking at parties last night. But we know that cetaceans have that as well, and those social bonds last often a lifetime and are very complex and are linked to language and culture, which is incredibly unusual in the animal world. And I think the other really interesting thing about cetaceans and people is, God, we both really like to travel as well. You know, these animals are quite happy to go from one end of the world to the other, and so are we. So there's a lot of common things going on there, and I think it's also really important to bear in mind that we have this incredible heritage as well around the world with cetaceans. Cetaceans are, you know, for coastal communities in many parts of the world, are really, really important part of traditional and modern culture. And that goes all the way back to even the Stone Age. So it's a really, really long history. So I think, you know, you can summarise whale heritage sites in words and in pictures, and in many ways, it's the bringing together of as many stakeholders as possible in a community and pointing them in the direction of responsible interactions with whales and dolphins, celebrating whales and dolphins. And this is just my kind of way of perhaps describing that interaction in a less formal way. And you've got all these different stakeholders. You've got politics, you've got sculpture, you've got visitors, you've got academics, you've got museums, you've got television. All of those things come together to make whale heritage sites, and many, many, many other things too. So the process for whale heritage sites, and I'll go through it in more detail in a minute, but just very, very briefly, it goes something like this. A whale heritage site needs to have some kind of responsible framework for managing its whale watching. That can be manifested in a number of different ways. It must celebrate the close cultural association between cetaceans and people, and it needs to seek a sustainable balance between the natural environment and the needs of local communities and businesses and visitors, which we talked about partly yesterday. And of course, it needs to show a proven commitment towards research, education and awareness. And if you can tick all those boxes, you know, you've got a chance of being accredited as a WHS. And, you know, as I said, we're in very, very early stages of the Whale Heritage Site programme. We have a number of initial applicants, a small number of candidate sites, and we have yet to accredit our first site. But we wanted to just take a look at those first 10 initial applicants. And at this point, you don't have to pay a fee. It's very, very early stages, but I think it tells us something really interesting. So of those first 10 applicants for Whale Heritage Sites, they cover 37 species of cetaceans within those sites. 22,000 kilometres squared of land. We're talking about a whale and dolphin conservation initiative, but we're talking about 22,000 kilometres squared land area where cetaceans don't exist. And I think that's so exciting. This is about the fact that we all realise it's what we do on land that affects what happens in the oceans. And that's incorporated into Whale Heritage Sites. Over 1 million kilometres squared of ocean. I'd be pretty happy if I'm lying on my deathbed and we've actually managed to get 1 million kilometres squared of ocean under any type of accreditation that means it's better place for whales and dolphins. 2 million resident people live in the area of those first 10 initial applicants for Whale Heritage Sites. And the revenue, which is hard to calculate, I must admit, but this is a very rough figure, but we're looking at about $28 million direct revenue from whale watching across those 10 sites, which is not an insignificant amount of money per annum to be raising. So, ballpark figures, but I think it's sort of taking us in an interesting direction. And then finally on this presentation, I'll move on to the more detailed one. I think it's been really interesting to see that our WCA partners around the world, some of which are in this room, have been amazing advocates for the Whale Heritage Site programme, and in many places have been sort of driving those applications and looking for other stakeholders to come in and join the process. And long may that continue, because I think our partners understand the value of collaboration and cooperation and partnership, and want to share that in their local communities. And it's brilliant for the Whale Heritage Site programme because it means that people already based in those locations are driving the process, and that's what we're looking for. We are not looking to be an outside international source that comes in and says, you've got to do this way, this is the criteria. The criteria is actually very, very flexible. We want local communities to create their own whale heritage sites in the way that fits those communities and those different cultures and languages and political landscapes and scientific landscapes and everything else. And our partners know exactly how to do that. So I think that's a really, really exciting kind of element of the programme. Excuse me, I'll just go on to the second presentation. So I think it's important, given that we have 2 days on whale heritage sites, to give you a little bit of history. Some of you will be aware of this, but also a little bit more detail. The Whale Heritage Site Programme came into existence because of 2 things. The WCA has worked a lot in the tourism sector, and we work a lot with our whale watching partners, but we've also been campaigning really hard on the issue of keeping whales and dolphins in captivity. And during that campaigning work, we talked to the travel industry in Europe, and we asked them if we tried to encourage them to take the alternative for their customers to seeing whales and dolphins in tanks and encourage them to see them in the wild. And in turn, they gave us some advice. And one of the key pieces of advice that they gave us was, well, okay, we could do that, but if the millions of people who came to see whales and dolphins in aquariums suddenly went out on whale watching boats, we'd have a huge problem. I don't think it would do our reputation any good if that happened, which is a fair point. And we said, okay, fine, how do we manage that? How would you be interested if we had an accreditation scheme for whale watching boats? Would you hook up with those particular partners? And we can tell that from the Virgin presentation 2 or 3 days ago, but they are now considering those kind of processes. But at the time, they said that's just way too complicated for us. We've got 5,000, 10,000 suppliers. Getting down to the level of what's happening, us being able to assess or us understanding what individual boat operators are doing is a really big ask. But if you're able to accredit a destination, a site, so that all of the companies are acting responsibly, that's so much easier for us as a business. We can hook into that, and we can market that site ahead of another site that we might be promoting at the same time, because we know that you've done the work for us and it's responsible. And that was a really sort of penny dropping moment, I think. Thank you, Miranda, for this slide. But also at the same time, we were having all these discussions with our whale watch partners, and they were saying, look, it doesn't matter how responsible we are as a company, unless we can get on top of everything else that's happening in our place, unless the governments are licensing and managing the industry properly, unless we can collaborate with our other whale watching companies more, unless we can get more scientific understanding of what's actually happening out there, basically, unless we can engage all these stakeholders, we just cannot make this place responsible. So all of this was telling us one massive thing, which is we have to look at sites, we have to look at destinations. And we originally did that by doing a little piece of research in which we looked at 12 whale and dolphin watching sites around the world and what kind of stakeholders were involved to make them responsible. We had a measure for them being responsible, which is open to debate. But what came back to us was a really interesting thing. It showed that in those more responsible sites, we did see exactly what we anticipated, that there were lots of stakeholders involved in the management of the whale and dolphin watching industry. But what was cooler than that was that every site was different, and every site was using a different collection of those stakeholders to make it work. So there's no one size fits all here. It depends on what your resources are in one particular location. And we realised that that was a real strength. There was no point telling somebody in Sri Lanka that follow the model in Canada, but there might be real value in telling people in Sri Lanka how it's all working out well in Peninsula Valdez in Argentina. So really big lessons to learn there. And fundamentally, and we covered all this at the last summit, fundamentally we kind of view whale watching as this balance between collaboration and self-management within the industry, which when it works is incredibly powerful, but also the importance of enforcement from government or enforcing agencies who have the ability to take boats out of the water if they continually reoffend. Those two things are critical to responsible whale watching. So what is whale heritage sites? Two ways of possibly looking at it. This would be the sort of simpler definition. So whale heritage sites are the only globally recognised way to identify destinations that implement and celebrate responsible and sustainable whale and dolphin watching. That is absolutely true, and that's a good sort of marketing brand for us when we go and talk to tourist boards. The slightly more UNESCO World Heritage Site way of putting it just involves more complicated words, but it's basically a similar message. So a whale heritage site is an outstanding location where cetaceans, I think we all know what that word means now, are embraced through the cultural, economic, social and political lives of associated communities, and where people and cetaceans coexist in an authentic and respectful way. We went through a long stakeholder process to define the criteria for whale heritage sites, and I think over 600 people in many countries around the world were involved in that stakeholder process. It included the first Whale Heritage Site Summit as well, and these were the criteria that we came up with, and I think they're pretty good. So there's 4: encouraging respectful human cetacean coexistence. It's a bit of a strange phrase. What it means is, it means responsible whale watching. The idea being that the most responsible whale and dolphin watching that you can ever have is where we, as people or boats, and the animals are actually just coexisting in the same space. We're not impacting upon them at all. They approach us, it's completely on their terms. So that's why we use the word coexistence. Number 2, celebrating cetaceans, the good stuff. The Sodurba Whale Festival, that's what that's all about. Environmental, social and economic sustainability, the big one that we all have to try and cover off. And then research, education, and awareness. So I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can, but I do think it's important that you guys have a good overview of this. So criteria for whale heritage sites focuses on how people celebrate, benefit from, and seek to conserve the cetaceans with which they coexist. That word again. Each whale heritage site may find its own unique means appropriate to its local context, including geography, culture, economics and politics, to satisfy the criteria with the required rigour. So the idea there is that flexibility is so important. This is about local sites keeping the uniqueness and building on that uniqueness of the places that they are, not taking it away. In meeting Whale Heritage Site criteria, a candidate site must take into account information relating to the relevant local cetacean populations, including their status, numbers, biology, habitat, behaviour and welfare. Overarching the criteria is the premise that whale heritage sites will promote respective, positive coexistence with cetaceans. Okay, so they're going into the criteria in a little bit more detail. So this is the first one, and there are quite a lot of sub-criteria involved here. So encouraging respectful human cetacean coexistence. This is managing whale and dolphin watching in nearly all sites. So the Whale Heritage Site is developed and seeks to continually improve a responsible framework managing people and cetaceans. Guidelines and regulations related to the interactions between people and cetaceans support international practice and are appropriate to local contexts. They must be developed collaboratively by all key stakeholders, reviewed regularly and clearly communicated to relevant audiences. And we've covered a lot of those subjects over the last few days. Guidelines or regulations must be monitored by a minimum of 2 authorities, one of which is advisory, but the other should be a responsible government body. We found that in some of these most responsible sites, they didn't rely on just one agency or organisation to manage the whale watching and pick out the bad guys. They relied on 2. So it meant that if one fell down, the other was still doing its job. And that seemed to really make the difference. Regular training takes place for skippers, crew, guides, onshore staff, etc. I think we'd all agree with that. A permit system exists that manages and limits licenses for cetacean interactions according to best available local research. And mechanisms are in place to encourage ongoing reduction of environmental impacts. And for all of these criteria, the applicant is allowed to drop 1 criteria. So it's very interesting. The Vancouver Island North application, which is closest to full accreditation, they don't have a permit system. And that's incredibly unusual. Generally, I think we would look for that. but they've convinced us that in this particular case, it's not necessary. So the next thing, celebrating cetaceans. The Whale Heritage Site celebrates the close cultural association between cetaceans and people. And for me, this is possibly the most exciting criteria, just because I think it gives people unbelievable flexibility to do really, really cool things that are relevant to their local cultures. So while cetaceans are reflected in culture through historical or contemporary practices that harness a greater appreciation for living cetaceans in their natural habitats. Cetacean-related festivals, ceremonies, meetings or other events that encourage a sense of pride, heritage, history, sustainability and legacy are held annually. And cetacean-related works of art are created, including in music, dance and theatre, the visual arts and in literature from both written and spoken traditions. Who wouldn't want to go to a place like that and go whale watching? I certainly would. This is a really big one. We could have a whole accreditation scheme, obviously, just on environmental sustainability, and others of course do. But this is our attempt to encourage it at these sites. So, the Whale Heritage Site seeks to achieve an environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable balance between the natural environment, the expectations of visitors, the needs of the local community, and the business that operate there. First one is economic sustainability. Sustainable livelihoods are created, generating employment and financial benefits. I won't go too much into the details there. Social sustainability is also a really interesting aspect. Local communities are recognised as key Whale Heritage Site stakeholders. So you cannot go through the process of becoming a Whale Heritage Site without making serious efforts to involve as many people as possible. That's going to reduce that potential backlash from the local community who say, when you announce that you've got that accreditation, they turn around and say, what on earth is that? We never even heard of it. So, being given the opportunity to participate in decision making at key stages, being informed via press, social media, other means about Whale Heritage Site candidacy, involved in preparing and maintaining the site for Whale Heritage Site status, and engaged in educational and community outreach events that promote Whale Heritage Sites. Environmental sustainability, and this is really the marine conservation element of Whale Heritage Sites. We had to be very careful when we developed the accreditation process, because Whale Heritage Sites is not marine protected areas, and marine protected areas are a biologically focused means of protecting cetaceans, or we are not. We're a people-focused, community-focused means to protect cetaceans. But it's in there. So environmental sustainability, the marine and terrestrial ecosystems within the Whale Heritage Site must be maintained and preferably enhanced to support a thriving population of wild cetaceans. Threats relevant to the primary cetacean habitat should be identified and an action plan developed to address those impacts within the control of local stakeholders. A range of measures to enhance general environmental sustainability should be undertaken. And then the final one, and I've cut this down, and the final option is to develop a sustainable destination management plan, in effect. For many sites, they can drop this in their application because it's a tough thing to do, and they don't have to meet every criterion. However, we would then encourage them to take on that plan as a Whale Heritage Site if they were accredited. And then the final one, which again we've all talked about so much over the last few days, is research, education and awareness. The Whale Heritage Site recipient has developed and seeks to continually improve its commitments towards research, education and awareness. Companies and organisations involved with cetacean interactions incorporate conservation-directed science and research programmes. Conservation-based cetacean research and policy is showcased within the site. Education programs that focus on cetaceans are delivered to local communities, and local sustainability initiatives benefiting the marine environment are showcased. So you can see there's an overlap between these criteria. Let's just quickly have a look at a few visual examples here, going back to Vancouver Island North. This wonderful traditional killer whale carving, which is such a feature of that particular area, and we'll be coming to back to that very shortly. This is absolutely fantastic. I've shown some of you these images at the workshop on Sunday, but this is a real favourite of mine. This is the Sitka Whale Fest 2016 kind of logo branding, really, and they show these killer whales eating their way through this old book, which is a great idea just to show the concept of whales through time. And this is a sort of cultural initiative and cool ideas that we want to share between these sites. This is a really cool and simple idea, again in Vancouver Island North, talking about setting the highest standards. The flag that you can see on the boat behind this killer whale shows that this is a whale watching boat, but also that the boat is in the vicinity of cetaceans at this moment. So any other vessel, including whale watching boats, familiar with the flags will know that there are cetaceans near the vessel, and so should therefore be acting in a precautionary way. It's very, very clever. This is down in New South Wales in Australia. It's called the human whale. It's done once a year as part of the returning humpback whale migration, and it's free. It doesn't cost anything. It's just people on a beach forming a shape and getting in the papers, and that's more awareness. And we love that stuff. We got to share some of that stuff. Other communities could be doing similar or cooler things. But I think we must come back to this. It's really important for whale heritage sites to work. It has to differentiate the best from the rest. It has to be a high bar, and other people need to move up to that bar. So differentiating world-class whale and dolphin watching destinations we have to do. And then the most important thing of all, educating the next generation of ocean advocates. So this is something we were running. This is my oldest daughter, dressed as a turtle. Poor thing. And we ran a thing called the Ghost Fishing Net Challenge last year, where we got an old trawl net, we got kids to dress up as marine animals, and they had to basically go from one end of the trawl net to the other as a race. And of course they got entangled a little bit, and so they got the whole principle of what it's like to be in a net, and some of the issues of ghost fishing that we have across the world's oceans. And I think finally, it's important to say, I think, that we face many challenges in this world, and we have there's some serious issues that cetaceans still face, despite the good stuff about recovering humpback whale and other populations from the bad old days of whaling. And even in Europe, all these images are just from Europe, never mind what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think whale heritage sites and the WCA are all about trying to encourage people, communities, away from what we would refer to as sort of negative interactions between people and cetaceans, consumptive interactions between people and cetaceans, and towards a more respectful and therefore a more sustainable approach to our own lives in relation to these animals. And so that's what whale heritage sites, I think, is a beacon for that. It's the place that we want to head to and to encourage people towards and away from some of this stuff. And I think it's a very, very powerful tool to be able to do that. And these are some of the wonderful images from some of the initial applicant sites from around the world, from Canada, from Argentina, from Portugal in the Azores, and from Australia as well. So really, really exciting potential there. Okay, so there will be lots of time for questions and debate, but we won't do it just yet because I've got a bit of an icebreaker for you.